Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Autodesk Virtual Academy, brought to you by KETIV Technologies. I'm Nigel Mbike, your host for today, and today I'm joined by, as you can see on the screen here, Javier Chavez. How's it going, Jav?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing all right. I'm really excited for today's webinar. So today we're going to be going over something I think is very essential in the Inventor workflow, and that's creating that documentation. So those IDW and DWG files that are so crucial, generally are deliverable to people, whether they're in, they need to manufacture it or you need to send it out to vendors, so on and so forth. So Hav's going to go over some of the essentials in regards to making some of these drawings. It is a very key part of the workflow. Anything else you have to add there, Hav?
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's important, right? We create all these 3D models. We spend a ton of time and effort trying to create them accurately. And if you don't have documentation that reflects all that accuracy, all the detail that you put in there, you're probably not communicating as effectively as you could, right? And so you mentioned some essentials. And certainly we'll talk a little bit about that, but we're definitely going to get into little, picks and clicks that maybe aren't necessarily very apparent, things that'll make your drawings maybe pop or communicate those bits of information better.
Awesome. Thanks, Hav. If anyone has any questions, like always, make sure to type them into the chat panel at any time during the webinar, and we'll make sure to address those during the Q&A at the end. So with that, I think we're good to go. Let's go ahead and start running through.
Start drawing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So anyways, in regards to the session, I've kind of broken it up into two major parts of this, right? Creating views and annotation, and even your drawing environment is kind of set up that way. If you notice, when you get into the drawing environment, there's two tabs, major tabs that are there. One is to basically create views. The other one's for annotation, right? And so you can see some of the topics there. And we're going to get into this. We have a productivity training session coming up next week on the same subject. So watch out for that. If you're on Streamline, take a look at some of the notifications. Same subject, but we're going to go into a bit more detail and maybe include some other things that maybe we don't have time for. We've only got between 30 and 40 minutes to go through this. So I'm going to try to make it quick, short, sweet, and at the same time try to squeeze in as much as possible. Okay, so we'll start off with views, and we'll come back to this slide and just kind of review a little bit. But we'll start off with views and take a look here. So some simple things, right? If you're trying to make your drawings pop a little bit, as you're putting in the view, I've already got this one in, but as you're putting it in, you've always had this option to basically, put it in a perspective mode. So in addition, right, you can always customize the view. The view cube now shows up here as you're putting in your view. So whether you want to show a front view, a right side view, it makes it a bit easier to do that with, right? And so I'm going to continue showing the home view, but with one extra click here, we can click on this pull down next to this and make sure to show this in a perspective mode, right? So just something really simple, right? As we do this, that makes maybe some of your drawings pop. Not to mention, just showing it shaded, right? But that's very, it's at the surface level. It's really easy to access. You guys have seen that. Let's move on here to the next thing I want to show you. So there's a lot of times where, you want to focus in on a detail here. And really what I want to focus in on is right here, this hole. And I don't want to, show a whole lot of other geometry or objects here. But I have to, because if I make this detail too small, right, it shows up like this, right? And again, I want to focus in on the hole. So one of the things that you can do to alleviate this, right, is keep this detail this way, okay? And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and move the detail off the screen and create a detail of the detail. So if I go to the detail tool, this happens all the time. I've seen it in several drawings that our customers do, and we've been teaching this for a while. But I'm going to go ahead and create a detail here of this, right? And by default, it wants to ratchet up to the next letter as opposed to E. We could force it to be a duplicate, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make it E as well. And I'm going to go ahead and create my smaller detail here. I'm going to place it right over here. And as far as anybody's concerned, right, this detail is calling out this detail, right? This call out is calling out this detail here. Okay. This one just stays out here, and it's just kind of a placeholder. we need it, we can't delete it, but it doesn't print. Okay. So, that's one way to create, these details. And again, that detail circle doesn't have the same border as this other detail. Okay. So another thing that people ask about and need to do every once in a while is move a detail view or move any view in general, right? So I've got some other sheets here. I have the small detail sheet I'm on. I have another layout here that's empty. And I'm going to go ahead and move one of the details. So the way this is done, I'm going to go back to the sheet where this detail resides. And if it's hard to tell, what's what in terms of details here and related to what's over here on your browser, just right click over the view you want to move, right? And tell it to find it in the browser, right? And it should highlight it, right? So even if this was all closed up, it'll open it up, expand it, and highlight it. So whatever view you're trying to move, you can simply drag it right under the view or the sheet that you want to place it under, and it moves over there. So this now resides on this sheet. Maybe you could set this to not print if you don't want it out in space like we did just a moment ago. Okay, so moving views is something you can do to quickly get those views to a different sheet. If you started off and things get crowded, you can do that. Okay, so as we move on here, right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to this other sheet. And just take a look at this assembly here. There's lots of stuff inside of it, and some of the things we can do to change the way this looks. I'm going to go and open up the assembly. Okay, and there's lots of times where we have some components in an assembly that are there, maybe not meant to show up in a bill of materials. So if I bring up my bill of materials, right, we could see everything here is set to a BOM structure that shows it as normal. Okay, so this stuff is starting to affect what shows up on our drawing. That's always been the case, but I'm going to go ahead and take this file here, it's the cylinder head, and change the display of this. So I'm going to change it as and make it show up as a reference. So that does a couple things. Visibility wise, maybe if we're just showing this for reference and we don't intend for this to be on a bill of material, I can go to the next tab, and that component just fell off the list of item or ballooned components. It was number 9. Okay, still shows up here as just reference. And what that does to your drawing, if you're just showing something for reference, right, it changes the way it looks. So let's get back to that drawing for just a sec. Right, you can see it changes the way it looks. It now shows this in this reference line geometry. Okay, so it makes it really obvious, and you could certainly add leaders or something to this to annotate it and say shown for reference only. Again, good thing, doesn't show up on our bill of materials anymore, and we get to show it this way. Okay, so I'm going to undo this for just a sec. I'm going to come back to that last component that last assembly that we were on. Okay, and just show you maybe something else we can do. I'm going to go ahead and undo that, or maybe change it back to a normal part, and you'll see that on the bill of materials, it gets added back in. It got added in now as number 11. Okay. Okay, so the drawing should be up to date and be back. Now, if you notice, when I made that a dashed line, we saw some internals. There's lots of stuff inside of here. We can certainly go to the Edit View tab and show hidden lines. Oops, I clicked that incorrectly. There we go. So lots of stuff here. And this is one way to kind of show what's inside. But I'm going to show you another way. Right, let's go ahead and change that back. Okay, and so in our assemblies, one of the features that came out within the last couple releases was a feature that lets us make stuff transparent just within the assemblies. You could basically select a part, right click, and make it transparent. So you could do the same thing here within the drawing and make this top part or whatever parts you choose transparent. The key here is as I try to pick the part, I'm in a line, edge, select mode. I'm not going to get those right click options that I need. So make sure that when you're working with your drawings, you shift right click so that you pick what it is you want. In this case, I want to pick parts. Now I've picked the part, and because I've picked a part, I've got part options, right? So a number of things we could do. We can certainly suppress it. We can, show it in a number of ways. But again, we're able to show this almost any way we want. In this case here, I'm going to go ahead and find it in my browser, or maybe right-click and just make it transparent here, right? So it's a little bit different. It doesn't show it as hidden lines. It shows it as if this were made out of glass. Okay, so just another way to view things, and if you're trying to communicate what's inside of that that component, this is one way to do it. Okay, so moving on here, if we start to take a look at some of the other things we can do in here, let's start to take a look at assemblies, right, and how we can depict them. And there's a number of ways we can start to look at these assemblies. We can certainly create instructions, and that's one of the things that drawings are most effective at doing, is showing people how to assemble our designs. So if I go to the first sheet here, we've got exploded views. These all come from the same exploded view, and we've documented this as step 1, step 2, right? And as we move on here, we've got step 3, and there's probably some other more final steps here to document this. Okay. Again, this comes from a IPN file, and if you're going to do this and do this effectively, it makes sense to start at the assembly level and plan for this. So what I'm going to use here is I'm going to go ahead and use view representations. I'm going to use an exploded view, and I'm going to start calling them out in the drawing. Okay. So here's an unfinished version of this, and I'm just going to simplify this and bring up a different assembly that's maybe easier, quicker to put together. Let's go ahead and open that up. So let's go ahead and find that. Okay. So I'm going to create some view representations, and again, this is at the moment it's for the purpose of creating documentation. And so view representations, if you're not familiar with them, basically control the visibility of these components, whether they're on or the visibility is on or off, or maybe you've changed colors, made them transparent, you name it. Okay, so I'm going to do this in maybe a 2-step process, right? I want to show, and you'll see this here in just a sec, I want to show how the internals go together, and then assemble the externals over that. So it's a 2-step process in this case, right? So first step here is I'm going to create a view that represents step 1, okay? So I'm going to create a new view, right? There's view 1, and step 1 would be to basically assemble the internals. So all I want to see at this point is the internals. I'm going to name this accordingly, right? And I'm going to call this step 1 view. Okay, all I want to see is what's included in step 1. So a couple ways to do this. The easiest thing I can think of right now is to just pick these 2 objects, right? Pick them both and just turn off the visibility, right? And isolate the components underneath. Okay, so I've got everything I need for step 1. And when I come back here, I'm going to go ahead and create another view. But I think what I'll do is I'll come back to the default view, which showed everything, and I'll right-click and create another view, right? And I'll go ahead and rename this to step 2 view, right? And this is what I plan to use. Now, in a more complicated assembly, like we saw just a minute ago, you're going to do this over and over again until each view represents just what you want to see in the individual steps. Okay, so in this particular one, I want to see everything. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we'll go ahead and start creating the presentation file that we're eventually going to put into our drawing. So it's interesting. We're talking about documentation, but it really starts with the parts and assemblies that you guys work with. So new file, right? And we'll start with an IPN here. Okay. And as soon as I do this on this presentation file that's meant to, take these existing assemblies apart, right, it's prompting me to, select an assembly. So I'm going to go right here where this file exists. This is the one I was just working on. And here it is. And at the moment, I want to work on step 1. And so if I take a look here, you can see there's scene 1. I'm going to rename this so that it shows up as step 01. Okay. And the assembly, I don't know necessarily what the visibility state is, but I'm going to make sure that I right click on that step 1. I go to representations, and you can see here it's showing step 2. So I want this to be step 1. We can make this associative so that it always reflects exactly what is set as step 1 in the assembly or not, right? And I'll click OK. Okay. And so I'll proceed here to start to take this apart and show people how this gets assembled, right? So with that said, I'll just start, tweaking these components. So first thing that comes off here is, oops, let's undo that. There we go. Next thing is this washer, and I'll start to take that apart, right? And then maybe the spring, and I'll start to remove some of these other components. So I could go on here and completely disassemble this. I'm going to start maybe disassembling some of the other components down towards the bottom. Right, and I could always adjust all of this information here a little bit later, but again, I'm starting to disassemble some of these components. So when I look at the tweaks, if I need to adjust something here, I can see some of the tweaks here, some of the movements, and start to readjust. In this case, I want to move this washer a little bit farther out, and I want to move maybe this component just a little bit farther out. But again, I'm showing how this goes together. So there's step 1, and at this point, right, I'm going to go ahead and create a snapshot. Okay, so here's my snapshot. This is the view I'm going to use as step 1. Okay, and I'm going to move on to now, show people how to assemble the rest of this. So over here, I'm going to create a separate view altogether, right? So new snapshot view. It's going to have me, oops, go ahead and delete that. There we go, new scene. And I'm going to go to basically the same assembly. So it's possible to assemble several components in this one scene or in this one file. And so in this case here, I'm going to go ahead and continue on here and pick the same file over again. And I could do this early, right? I can go to options now instead of waiting till later and tell it, hey, I want to go ahead and use my step 2 view, right? And only those components are going to be visible here in just a moment, right? Which in this case is pretty much everything, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and take this, start to disassemble it, right? This is step 2, assemble the housing around this, right? And I'll begin to tweak this, move this down. So again, I can get pretty detailed about this, but I am going to, rename some of the scenes here so that they correspond to the different steps. Okay. I'm also going to create a view. This is, again, what's going to end up on my drawing and create a snapshot. Okay, so this is, again, what I want on my drawing. Okay, so I think I'm ready to go. If I come back to the drawing that I was just on here, right, and I start to document this, I'm going to go ahead and create a base view, right, and I'll go ahead and save this IPN before I do that. Okay, and right away I get options. The first set of components, or this first choice here before the colon, is the scene. They happen to coincide. In some of these scenes, you can create multiple steps. So maybe the second scene might be step 2 and 3 and 4. But I'm going to stick to step 1 here and just show step 1, the assembly. And in this case, maybe it makes sense to show it in an isometric view, or a different orientation, or maybe even start to show it this way. So again, you can play with this and kind of change this. I'm going to call this step 1. Let's make that all caps. Okay, and I'll show the label. Okay, so step 1, we assemble the internals, and then I'll create another base view where now I reference step 2. Right, and I'll go ahead and blow that up, make it a little bit bigger, just like this. And again, I'm referencing step 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and show that. So step-by-step instructions here. This is one of the ways you could do that, right? Pretty easy, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. As I go through and start to work with these, right? These are, again, some of the views I can go ahead and create. I'm going to come back to one of the other drawings here and start to maybe work with some different types of views. Okay, so let's see. Let's come back here, right, to yeah. Okay, so this view here is now showing an assembly that can, basically show up in multiple positions. So we've got this clamp, and it could show up in a closed position, in an open position, and maybe even overlay both positions so that you see the amount of travel that you see there. Okay, and so the way this gets done, we'll open up this assembly. Okay, it starts off with the assembly. Again, we're going to create some views, and it starts off with another way to represent this. So instead of view representations, we now have positional representations. Okay, and if we were to get rid of some of these, and I'll take a look at some of the relationships here, you'll notice that you'll always have a master positional representation, but from there you can create your own. All this does, I'm going to go back to master, okay, is change one of your, or maybe even suppress one or more of your constraints. So in this case, we mark this as drive piston, and in the master position, right, where it's open like this, it's at 10 millimeters, right? And so there's a piston that moves it up and down inside of here. We'll go ahead and highlight that here in just a sec. Let's go ahead and make this transparent, right? And you can now see, what's going on inside of there. Again, another newer feature, inside of Inventor. You can just right-click on files and just make them transparent. So you can see the gap on that piston in this position, right? We'll show it as open. We'll show it as closed, right? And this is changing from 10 millimeters to closed to 60 millimeters, and it's basically this gap. Okay, so the way that gets created, I'll go ahead and delete these and just basically recreate these. Okay, master position, this is the way we modeled it at 10. Identify your parameters, give them names so that you can find them very quickly, and we'll create position number 1. Okay, so in position number 1, which is what we're set to right now, we could rename that to open or closed, whatever it may be. But now that this is active, you can create alternate values for these constraints, right? So this is an insert constraint. If I right-click, I get options I don't normally see. I see override, I see modify override, I see suppress override, and in this case, I just want to modify the number that's there and change that to 60. Okay, and that creates just an alternate position, position 1. I'll right-click on this again and create another one. It always starts off back to the default, and this position might be maybe a halfway point, if you will. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and make it, halfway between that. I'll make it 35. So here, I'm going to right-click on the constraint that I want to modify and override that, make it 35. So really what I have is a few different positions. I'm going to go ahead and show this in this view. Master, right? Position 1, position 2, right? Somewhere in between. And obviously the angle of this doesn't change as much at 35, but I've got a bunch of different values and I can kind of document that range of motion. So if we go back to maybe the drawing that I want to go ahead and create here, let's come back to that here. Let's go ahead and create we'll create another sheet here. Okay. And let's rotate this. Okay. So I'm going to show this in one position or the other, right? I'm going to start off with master. Okay. If this shows up as transparent at the moment, so we could always change that back here and show it so that it doesn't show up as see-through, but it probably helps here in this case. So with that said, what if we want to go ahead and show all those positions, right? I can show another view just like this, show this in a different position. Okay, so same geometry, just you can see the clamp is closing here. Or even better, I could go ahead and lay these over the top of each other. So in this case here, I'm going to go ahead and click overlay. Whatever view I pick, I get to choose the other views that are not showing, or the other positional representations that are not showing. So I'm going to go ahead and show this one. And I have access here to position 1 and position 2. I'm currently set to master. That's what it shows right now. And so position 1 is going to show up in a different line type. I get to show it here as a overlay line type, which is going to be kind of dashed, or I could just show it regular lines, right? So I'm going to show it as overlay. I think it'll be more obvious what we're doing there. And if I click OK, you could see that line work. Okay, I could do it multiple times. So if I have lots of different positions that I've captured, I'm going to click overlay. I'm going to pick on this view, and I'm going to tell it to overlay, another position number 2, right? And so you could see there, I've captured, some of the range of motion there. And this is geometry that you can dimension to and annotate and work with. Okay. So again, more ways to, capture your design intent. Here again, I'm capturing the range of motion. So as I go on here, I'm going to go ahead and move over to another file here, or actually we'll stick with, we'll start to look at sections. So here, right, another way we show things is we start to cut away stuff. And there's a number of ways you can cut into geometry. This is a finished version where we, have a breakout view. In some of the other sheets, we'll also take a look and we'll see section views here. So let's start with maybe something that's not quite done yet, right? So when we talk about section views, which is what we're going to look at here right now, when we talk about section views, anything that cuts into the geometry is considered a section view. And so just so for your reference, so that you see, what we have here, this is a projected view, right, of this geometry. It's just another view rotated, but it is projected. So whatever happens here is going to be reflected here. And so I want to go ahead and show you what we're going to do here. So we're going to cut into this and create what's called a breakout view. So if you guys ever go to a trade show and they sort of sacrifice a motor and start to break in and cut into the case to show you the internals, that's what we're doing. The way this is done, we create a sketch. And I'm going to create a sketch that breaks into it in this view. The sketch has to be attached to this view. So I'm going to pick the view first and then click the sketch tool. You've done it correctly when your crosshairs are directly centered over the view. Okay, so whatever I sketch, regardless of what I'm going to do this, how I'm going to use this, is going to be attached to this view. And as a view moves left or right, it's attached to this. Okay, so I'm going to create a view that kind of cuts into this geometry. And I'm going to do this with just some line work. Previously, whoever, the example I showed you showed a circle, right? I'm going to make it a little different. I'm going to make it jagged. So I'm going to zoom in nice and close. And if you've ever tried to make jagged lines in a sketch, here's a tip for you. As you start to click and pick and click, you're getting these inferred constraints. Most of the time when we're creating geometry, that's a good thing. In this case, it's going to drive me crazy if I want to go ahead and edit this. So a tip for you guys, right? I'm going to hit escape and get out of this. As you're drawing this line work, if you hold your control key down, right, it doesn't apply any of those inferred constraints. So I'm going to create some jagged line work here as if this is broken, right? And it looks like I kind of skipped some line work there. So what I want here is a closed profile. So once I get outside of the part, I don't have to make it jagged anymore. I will need to, close up this little gap I left here. Okay. And so the significance of us not putting constraints, I'm free to adjust this without worrying about little perpendicular constraints and this kind of going crazy on me, right? So one closed loop profile, if I click finish sketch, I'm ready to create my breakout view. So when I click breakout view, it is a type of section view. And I can tell it here now to take this view. It's only going to work if we have a sketch. So if you don't have a sketch, it's going to bark at you and tell you you need one, right? And it's going to take that profile and cut into the part. So how far do you want to cut in? That's up to you. So there's a number of options here that say, you know, we can break all the way through, right? And that would go through every single component that's here. There's another option that says, you know, through a single part, right, to reveal maybe some of the other components that are there. So there's a number of ways we can do this. I'm going to choose through part. And so now it's up to me to pick a part. I'm going to go ahead and tell it, hey, let's go ahead and cut just through this outer shell here. And once we click OK, you can see it cuts into it. You got this jagged cut here. And, you know, I don't like the way it shows up. I kind of want to move or rotate or create that view and bring it more towards this part. And this is another case where sometimes you create views to create views. So you could, you know, move this off the screen if your intent was just to create a broken view, isometric view, and not have this. So I don't, you know, like necessarily the way it turned out. I don't see enough of the internals here, so I'm going to edit this and make this break a little bit bigger. So the way I do that, on the view itself, you know, I can right-click and find the view in the browser. It highlights over here, and I can see the breakout view. Underneath it is my sketch. I can right-click and edit that, and because of the way I created it, it should be, you know, a bit easier to start moving around, you know, some of these edges. And start to, you know, redefine these jagged little components here, right? So this is much easier than, you know, what we had earlier or what you might have had with, you know, little inferred constraints, things like that. So, you know, we can make it cut a little bit deeper. We can exaggerate that, or we can even restart the sketch from scratch, delete everything and start over. Okay, so I'm going to continue here and start moving some of this geometry. There's a constraint there that's probably going to nag at me here at some point. Okay, so I'll click Finish Sketch, and I'm just revealing a little bit more, right, of that assembly the way I want it to. Okay, so if it makes sense, you know, maybe it makes sense to maybe create another projection of this. As long as I project it, right, to one angle or the other, right, I could start to maybe show this a different way. So this angle, you know, shows it pretty good. And I'll edit that very quickly just so that you can see this a little bit better. So just another way to show that cut into that. And you can see a nice sharp shard there. But it's starting to reveal some of that. Okay, so just different ways to section. I'm going to come back to another area here and show you a couple ways to section this. So this is interesting because this has some symmetry here in thirds. And so if you section just all the way through, okay, you'll get, you know, everything that shows up on one side of that line or the other. If you section a little bit differently, you can get some different results. Okay, so as soon as you start to go towards the center and create your section line this way, you can create what's called a rotated section. Okay, so it's just something to consider when you have, you know, parts like this that don't necessarily section evenly. Okay, so let's go ahead and create that section. Here's a section tool, right? And I'm going to go ahead and tell it we want to section this view. I'm going to go ahead and hover over things I want to align to. In this case, the center of that fastener. I'm going to go to the center here and then align this way at an angle. Okay, so there's my section line. And when I right click, I can go ahead and continue here. Okay, so you'll notice here, I have two options here. Some that you never notice, it automatically, because I changed angles, went to aligned. And as I drag this to the right, you'll notice that it takes this fastener and shows it at the very bottom. It takes this entire line and rotates it this way. Okay, that's a little bit different, right? What that allows you to do is it allows you to, you know, dimension a little bit differently in this section view, and you would probably put a note that says it's a rotated view. If you ever want to change that, right, we can right-click on this, we can edit the section properties and make this projected. You'll see the difference here in just a sec, right? This is now sectioning and showing the bolt or the fastener perfectly aligned this way. And I'll do that one more time. Right? And you'll see here, you know, the bolt's no longer aligned. Instead, it's rotated. That section is rotated. Okay. In addition, right, while we're doing this, sometimes it makes sense to maybe not section something. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and project a isometric view of the section. It might not let us with this. Yeah, it should. Okay, so let's try this with just a regular section view. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. Okay, it doesn't look like it necessarily works with a rotated section like that. So I'm just going to section all the way through. Right, and when you do a single section line, you have no choice but to do this projected option. So I'll go ahead and place this right about here. Right, it's sectioning through, and I'll project this one more time. Isometric view, just so that you can see what's going on there. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and do a couple other things. Let's go ahead and make sure that this is shaded, right? And we'll change the scale as well. Let's go and make it half instead of quarter, right? Just so we can see a little bit clearer, more clearly what's going on. So right now, this is sectioning through everything. You want a little more control. It makes sense sometimes to show things complete and whole. So while we're doing this, I'm going to change to basically my part selection mode. So shift right click lets you select objects a little bit differently. I'm going to choose part by part here on the original view, and I'm going to tell it what to section, what not to section. So somewhere in here, I'm going to see this component, right? I'm going to right click on it and tell it how to behave when it comes to sections. So it's just sectioning like normal. I'm going to tell it to not section. All right, so let's see if I can grab that again. And I think I might have to do it here. There we go. So it's no longer sectioning, it's showing it as whole, and that's really apparent here. I can continue here and do the same thing for some of the other components like the shaft. Right click in the section view, tell it, hey, I don't want to section this, and this shows up complete. And I can move on here to maybe this washer here. It's now whole, and when I look over here, I get to see this complete. I could go on to quite a few other parts and do the same thing and tell them to show up complete. So be careful when you're doing this, just because sometimes you'll pick the hatch, even though you're in part mode. You want to make sure you pick visible edges, right click, and tell it not to section that entire part. Okay, so parts whole, right, not sectioned off. So you get some control over that. Okay, so are we getting any questions by any chance?
Yeah, there's a couple coming in for sure. In regards to doing multiple tasks in a particular view, like projections of projections or sections of sections, yeah, so on and so forth. Most of the stuff on the create side, you can do multiple of, if I recall. Once you start getting into the modify tab, which is where the breakout and the slice and crop is, generally you're not allowed to perform 2 of those tasks on the same view. That's a question I get a lot in support, is like, why can't I do a crop of a breakout, or I can't do a breakout of a crop? It just doesn't let you perform 2 of those tasks on the same view. So yeah, it's one of those things.
Yeah, so I don't know why that's the case. I would enter that in as a suggestion. So if you guys go to the ideas site, you can do that. As I'm moving along here, here's another option you have in terms of selecting parts. So when you do select these components, these all get assigned to layers automatically, visible edges versus hidden edges, you name it, right? So if you ever want to just change or highlight a part, you can right click and make sure you're set to highlight the entire part. We can select it, and on our annotate tab, it should show you what layer that geometry is on. And so it should make it easier to do that. But now that I've got the part, it's kind of hard to just change layers. It doesn't show up here. So I'm going to right click, and I should be able to pick, let's see, here we go. I should be able to pick the edges, right? Select those edges. So now I'm not picking the part, I'm picking the part's edges by doing this. Now it lets me go and do this, change the layer it's on. So if I want to show this now in a hidden layer or some phantom layer, or do a number of things, I can do that. If I want to, maybe change some of the properties of the geometry, I can right click one more time and go to properties and simply just change the color or change the line type or maybe change the line weight. There's a number of ways to do that. So in this case, let's just change the color and just make it red, right? And when I click away, I see that one part highlighted in red. Okay, so component selection lets you do a lot. Okay, so let's continue on here. Let's start moving towards drawings or the balloons and properties like that. So as we get to parts lists, annotations, and things like that, there's a number of ways you can show this. Here's a version that shows maybe some of the structure of an assembly. So we're starting to see that there's sub-assemblies here and they have their own set of components. So again, you can see a number of things here. So the main thing I want to show, right, in this case is a quick, easy way to balloon stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of some of the balloons I see here, right, and show you just some quick, easy ways to start ballooning. So when I go to the annotate tab, right, a lot of people do this. They just balloon things one at a time. And so when you do this by default, it does this. You pick, right, and that's all you want to do. You want to be done with this, but it thinks you want more segments. And so I don't know anybody who balloons like this. So it requires you to right click and choose continue, and then you could start to continue ballooning, right click, continue. So if you're doing that all the time and you're doing all that right clicking, I would advise you to make a change. So as you're ballooning, right click, and there's an option here for single segment leader. Put a check next to that, and now every time you click on something, boom, you're just ready to move on to the next balloon, right? Next balloon, next balloon. So, okay, even quicker than that is adding balloons using auto balloon. So one of the newer releases, I want to say 2018 or 2019, does a much better job of ballooning this way without crossing over edges or things like that. So it still does it to some degree, but it does it a lot less now. So when I go to auto balloon, I'm going to do this on a view by view basis. It's asking for a view. I'm going to go ahead and pick this view. Okay, and a lot of people will just balloon everything. I would advise you, if it's a bigger drawing, pick just the object maybe on one side of the view. So in this case here, it's asking me now that I've picked the view to pick the components. I'm going to pick just the components on this side, okay, and balloon on the top. So I'm going to create horizontal balloons, and when I click select placement, there's my balloons. Okay, are they too close together? Do they need to be farther apart? Then I just start to adjust the spacing and put them a little bit farther apart. 3 inches, 2 inches. This is on paper. So I'm going to go ahead and put these down here, right? And it does a pretty good job of not crossing over the part anymore like it used to, and picking the far edge as opposed to the close edge. Okay, so I'll apply that, and then I'll continue. I'll pick this view again, pick the rest of the parts here that maybe haven't been ballooned, and there's only one. I could tell it to ignore multiple instances and window around this, and can do that as well. But really, there's only one, and I'm just going to go ahead and choose select placement and place it right about here. Okay, so right, and so I've quickly ballooned this, and in a part or an assembly with a lot more components, you'll get a ton of balloons down very quickly. It's still faster, even if they're not exactly where you want them, to put these down and then make minor adjustments to move them, align them how you want. Okay. So another thing you might do is, let's just say this item number 2 was pointing to a washer, and it might not make sense to have, two balloons, really close, or 2 arrowheads really close to each other. It might make more sense to put, item 6 and item number 2 directly next to each other, right? So when you right click on a balloon, you could attach a balloon. You could attach it just by clicking on another part, right? And then your mouse is left here to kind of determine, is it going to go on top? Is it going to go to one side, like to the left? And so, right, we're assuming that that one arrow, right, we can get rid of this one now, is pointing to both. Okay. Sometimes, right, the object you're trying to point to isn't even visible here. Maybe it's, buried somewhere inside a shoulder of a recess or something in here. And so when you right click, you also have the option to add it from a list. So what's that list? It's the bill of materials. So obviously, the piston is not here, but I can certainly add a balloon that represents the piston, even though it's not visible, and even though I'm not, I don't have an arrowhead for it, and add it to this collection of balloons. So sometimes it makes sense to have one leader, multiple balloons, and basically point to one place and say, those are all there. Okay. So again, just different ways to annotate your drawing. And once I get back to our PowerPoint here, we'll talk a little bit more about, some of the things we're going to cover in the more extended version of this training. Okay. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping it up here. But some quick, easy ways to start making your drawings a little bit more effective, communicate more information. We'll come back here to our presentation. So, okay. So again, we started covering some of this stuff. We didn't get to some of the things that we had on our list here. We've only got 30, 40 minutes here. But if you are a Streamline customer, right? There's a productivity training session that's going to be a bit longer and go into more details into how to create, some more effective geometry. So it does start off at some point with the parts and 3D models assemblies that you create. It really does start there. And there's, of course, some things you can do in standardizing your drawings and creating standardized ways to show your parts list so that you don't have to make as many adjustments as maybe we did. Maybe it just comes in a certain way. Okay. So look for that. If you're a Streamline customer, look for some email notifications on that, and join us on that. Again, we're going to spend, what, 3.5 hours or so digging into.
Exactly. We're going to be digging into more of what Jav showed today. Some of the stuff that we couldn't get to today simply couldn't fit it all right into an AVA session. And we felt that it is necessary to see. So those of you who are Streamline customers, formerly known as VoltCare customers, expect an email from myself or Brian coming to you to get you and your team signed up for this training. It is included for those people who are on VoltCare/Streamline. So make sure to take advantage of that. If you don't know what that is, VoltCare/Streamline, please reach out to us if you're interested in attending this training, and we'll see what we can do for you. Stay tuned for those of you who are Streamline customers. Expect to see, I guess, triple, if not quadruple, the amount of information next Wednesday. Again, thanks for joining us all today, and we'll see you shortly. Thanks, Jav.
Yep.